Anselm dared to prove God's existence with a single idea, flawless, undeniable. What if his proof was a trap and nearly everyone since has fallen for it? Hello everyone, and welcome to the first episode in what I'm calling Dismantling Arguments for God. Something that I see a lot is you'll have individuals present arguments for God or attack arguments for God, and both of them will present a flawed version of the argument. Heck, sometimes they'll present the right version and still not understand what the argument is attempting and end up misusing it. What I hope to do is dive into the arguments, explain the history, context, and purpose of the argument, and then, in most cases, show why that argument fell short. Now, of the arguments that fit this category of being misrepresented and misunderstood, my personal favorite, and the one that fits this the best, is Anselm's Ontological Argument for God. Now, I do have to admit, when I first heard this argument, I hated it. Then I studied it some more, and I realized that it was so simple and cleverly crafted that it was genius. But I still didn't like it, and couldn't figure out why. Now, a lot of people will use Kant. I actually find Aquinas did a better job of disproving it and showing why it fails, and I'll get to that. And no, it's not the reason why atheists often say why it fails. So what exactly is this argument? Well, first off, it's not really an argument. It's a meditation and prayer done by St. Anselm, in which he was meditating on the passage, "The fool has said in his heart, there is no God." So he's pondering on what makes a fool and why saying there is no God makes one be a fool. Well, someone who believes in a contradiction would be a fool, so is there something about God that denying him is a contradiction? That was the question Anselm was meditating on. So he asked, what is God? Well, it's self-evident that God is that which nothing greater can be conceived. And actually right here we get into the very first misunderstanding. Most people, when they present this argument, they present God as the greatest possible thing or greatest possible thought. While these sound familiar, in preparing for this, I had a very drawn-out conversation with someone who insisted that these were identical. They are actually infinitely different. If God is greatest possible thought, then it doesn't matter what he is. He is bound by human thought, which has limits, which means that God has limits. But if he's that which nothing greater can be conceived, then instead of being bound to human thought, he is inherently beyond human thought. It doesn't matter what you think, it's not greater than God. So he's not limited by our ability to conceive a thing. So that's step one. Step two is, it is possible to conceive of a thing that exists as both thought and separate from thought. So, for example, I can think of a dust particle. Now, that dust particle has a real-life counterpart. And since I can conceive a dust particle and dust particles also exist separate from thought, it shows that we can conceive things that exist in reality. To be very clear, it is not saying that the thought created the dust particle, but that we can conceive things that exist in reality, not just abstract conceptual things. Existence in this period was understood to be a scale. From one end, you had abstractions, like math and numbers. They don't exist except as concepts, and are on the lower end of the scale than existing in reality. And to exist in reality was to possess more, so to speak, and to have a greater amount of existence. So when Anselm says it's greater to exist as both concept and reality, he isn't making a value judgment, but a quantity one, so to speak. He isn't saying that one is better than the other, but one is greater than the other. In fact, you'll have some claim Anselm is doing an equivocation fallacy, because he's saying in the definition of God that it's better, and here he's saying more than. Except he's not. In Latin, he says, aliquid quod majus non cogitari potest. Majus is the key phrase here. It means greater or large. So it's not a value judgment, but indeed a quantitative one. In fact, one way you could put it is there is no thought that is bigger than God. So from there, since dust would be bigger, because it's both thought and real, if God didn't exist except as thought, this leads to a contradiction, which only fools can believe. That's why the passage says the fool says in his heart, there is no God. Now, the argument does continue on from there, concluding that God is existence itself, because to say existence doesn't exist is a contradiction. Now, this isn't necessarily important to the overall argument or meditation of Anselm, but it is a part of the argument and is important to responding to a common objection that comes up. Of it, there's two common arguments against Anselm's meditation. The first is somewhat related to why this argument fails, but it still misses the mark. Because that requires a little bit more in depth, I'll address that later. The second one was actually originally formed by a peer of Anselm, Guanillo, who formed his argument in a work titled In Defense of the Fool. Now, most are familiar with his argument using a variation of like a horse such that no greater horse can be conceived, or a taco that is the most perfect taco. But Guanillo's example is actually a little bit more brilliant. He uses an island. In fact, he compares it to Atlantis. Now, why is that brilliant? Because even by that time, Atlantis was known to be fictional. So it was an island that existed only in the mind. The moniker Lost Island was a common title for Atlantis. Yet, the island was claimed to have the greatest city or be the greatest island ever. Here we see the first mistake. He says this island is the greatest or most perfect island, which means Guanillo is making a positive claim. Anselm is making a negative claim. Because of this, Guanillo is talking of an island with limits. Since it has limits, it can be restricted. God, going off of Anselm's definition, does not have limits. Second comes with the essence of a thing. So you remember that second part of the argument I mentioned that is often cut off? This is where its relevance comes into play. For Anselm, that which nothing greater can be conceived is what God is. He further defines and clarifies that to be that which nothing greater can be conceived is existence itself. Yet this lost island is an island. It being perfect and it possessing existence are accidental traits, something that doesn't affect what it has to be. Ergo, it not existing doesn't create a contradiction because the accidents of a thing can be added or removed without changing what the thing is. Thus, it doesn't matter if it's a horse, island, or flying spaghetti monster, because if existence is not its essence, its being, that which nothing greater of its category, can be conceived as an accidental trait, not an essential one. Since it's not essential, it not existing is not a contradiction like it is for Anselm. The second argument is, you can't just define something into existence. Unfortunately, this comes from a misunderstanding of what it means for something to be an ontological argument. It starts from self-evident truths to arrive at a conclusion. An example of an ontological argument is found in the subject of geometry. You start from self-evident truths called axioms, and from those axioms you arrive at true conclusions. For example, a definition of a non-parallel line is self-evident. It's the negation of parallel lines, lines that hold no point in common. In geometry, we can prove the existence of non-parallel lines and their properties. It's not the case that we defined it into existence. We said there is X and not X, which is self-evident from the law of the excluded middle and non-contradiction, and as well as the law of identity. From there, we are able to arrive at deeper truths of that, and that it is indeed the case that there are non-parallel lines. So it's not that the ontological argument defines God into existence, it starts from a self-evident truth. This is actually why I have a love-hate relationship with this argument. It's simple, there are no fallacies, and because the premise is self-evident, it leads to a conclusion, and thus, there is no room for error. Or is there? A lot of people like to bring up Kant's objection to Anselm's argument by stating that existence is not a property. However, I'm not sure I completely agree with that, and I'll touch on that in a later video. But even if Kant is true, that's not why Anselm's argument falls apart. In fact, Anselm's argument was falling apart long before Kant even started to talk about it. Related to my video on atheism, there is a quote of Aquinas on our ability to know God and the self-evidence, which is that God is self-evident to himself, but not to us. What does that mean? Well, just like the law of non-contradiction is self-evident to us, but not to an ant, because the nature of God is not self-evident to us, it's impossible for us to argue for God's existence using an ontological argument. Because it is not self-evident that God is that which nothing greater can be conceived. Thus, the reason the ontological argument fails isn't because it commits a fallacy, or because it defines something into existence. It's much more subtle than that. God isn't self-evident. A common struggle that I see a lot of people having is they think that if an argument is valid, as in there are no logical fallacies, and the conclusion logically follows from the premises, then it must be true. But that's what makes an argument sound, if and only if the premises themselves are true. In the case of Anselm's ontological argument, it's a valid argument. There's no logical fallacies, and the conclusion naturally follows from the premises, if and only if the premises are true. The thing is that the premise of God being self-evident, that Anselm bases his entire argument on, is not true. That's why the argument fails. You can have a valid argument that's wrong. But if you think that God is self-evident, or accept the premise that God is self-evident, then I hate to say it, you're stuck having to accept Anselm's conclusion. Otherwise, you are indeed the fool he was meditating on. Thank you for joining us today. I'm actually going to be discussing this a little bit more in depth and on Kevin's show here in the hopefully next few weeks. So save any questions or that you have for that. And if you miss it, feel free to leave a question in the comments below and bring up an argument that you think would fit into this series. I've got a couple of ideas already. Looking forward to continuing this argument and exploring the natures of the universe with y'all. God bless.